Good times, great music too, and you are FM 103.7. It's that time where we have a look at some of the things happening in the world of politics. We do that with Dr. Jim Jose, our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, who this morning, Jim, you would like to have a look at parliamentary sitting days, because we kind of get the impression that not a lot happens down there in Canberra,
Yes.
but it's not always that simple.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. It's often the case that someone will remark about the parliamentary sitting days. This year I think it's just over 40 that they're going to be sitting, which is a bit unusual.
Unusually low?
I think unusually low. It's I think it's about 54 all up when everything's taken into account. But we look at how regularly the parliamentarians sit in Canberra, and we go, wow, they're only sitting sort of 20 weeks of the year. What a cushy job. That life must be really easy. Well, that'd be a good job to have, sort of thing. Well, if we take a step back and think about that a little more, the sitting days are set up until the 1950s. The sitting days were more or less continuous with very short breaks in between, so that the parliamentary life was pretty awful in some respects, because particularly for those who didn't live in Canberra, which was nearly all of them. But by about 1994, there had been a few innovations, and in 1994 they have now the 3 sitting periods. And when they moved the budget to May, so you've got a sitting period in autumn from February through to April. Then you've got the budget sittings, which are May, June, and then you've got a spring sitting from August through to December. As a rule, generally, Parliament doesn't sit in January or in July. Now, in those periods, the Parliament sits for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and that's to allow people to actually stay in contact with their family. So usually, unless they've got other business in Canberra, and I'll get to that in a minute, they are able to then go home. Now, just think about it. You're away for 2 weeks, then you're home for 2 weeks, but knock out 2 days of travel out of that. So you're not home for 14 days, you're home for 12 if you're lucky. When you're home, back in your electorate, shall we say, you're then engaged in electorate business. And when you think about the demands on just the average politician in their electorate, it's quite significant, quite a significant workload. They're on the go all the time, not simply just dealing with electorate queries and issues from voters. They're also out there sort of attending school fetes, attending sporting functions, being seen and around, keeping up their profile, as it were.
It's kind of that catch-22, isn't it? Because at first glance, you'd look at that and go, wow, 40 or 50 days in Canberra, that's not a lot. But if they spent a lot more days there, they would be visibly and knowingly absent from their electorate. So the reverse would happen. It would be like, well, why aren't you spending any time here, hearing from the local people, getting the local, lay of the land? So it's kind of a fine line in that respect.
Yeah, that's one of the issues that, politicians have to try and attend to make sure that they're getting that right. For those who are senior ministers, or even just ministers, assistant ministers, there are times outside the parliamentary sitting time when they need to be attending to their portfolios. So certainly for ministers and assistant ministers, they need to be available. There will be times outside the sitting days when they need to stay in Canberra to be in their particular portfolio area. On top of that, there's also the committee meetings that are also outside of the sitting period. So if you're a politician who's a member of this committee or that committee, you're obliged basically to stay longer in Canberra. And for some politicians, this can be quite an onerous demand. So when we're looking at the sitting days as a measure of, how hard they work, that's just simply one aspect. For many of the politicians, and we think about the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Minister for Defence, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, their range of commitments are quite significant.
Yeah, they don't fit into 40 or 50 days, do they? I mean,
stuff
happens when it happens.
And certainly where the Foreign Minister's concerned and the Prime Minister, there's always the dimension of overseas travel where they need to be physically in the space talking to their counterparts or whatever the particular international issue is that they're addressing. So that's yet another load. And we might think, well, that's great. They get all this travel. Isn't that fantastic? But, I think after the first overseas trip, the shine wears off that very rapidly.
It was super quick before because the clock will beat us again, Jim. But quite often when we do see, we'll have the vision of Canberra and someone will be up giving a speech, probably very passionate about the issue of the day, and we just see a lot of empty green seats behind there. So is what kind of couldn't be behind that?
Well, ruling out question time, which is always a different game, but this particular issue, Mark, is. What a lot of people don't realise is that there's actually a second chamber in the House of Representatives where a lot of the second reading debate takes place. And when a bill's introduced, it's called, there are 3 readings. The first reading is when it's introduced. The second reading is when it's debated and argued over and amendments and that sort of thing. And the third reading is when it's put to the House to be passed. The second reading often gets shifted into this other chamber. So you will find that quite a few of the members of the Parliament will be in the second chamber engaging in the second reading and or often at committee meetings which might be running in parallel as well, which might have something to do with that particular piece of legislation. So when you look at the main chamber and there's, all these vacant seats and only a few people sort of sitting there conducting parliamentary business, it's not like that the rest of them have skived off, to go down the beach or something like that.
Happy hour or something, yeah.
Yeah, they're actually engaged elsewhere, primarily in the second chamber, but also in committee rooms dealing with sort of sub-parliamentary material. Plus, there are also a range of other issues that that ministers might be engaged with that calls them outside the House. So it's a tricky balance. The whips and the leaders of the government and opposition business keep tabs on who's where and what they're doing and try to make sure they're in the House when an important vote is needing to take place. But for the most part, Mark, just because the seats are vacant doesn't mean that the work is not going on.
All right. A lot to unpack there. But, Jim, an interesting look behind the green seats, I suppose the red ones if you think of the Senate as well. As always, Jim, a pleasure. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics, Dr. Jim Jose, with us on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.